It is officially patch day, and we have a lot to go over. Over 100 character buffs today. Yes. As per usual, the Big Encore machine has moved to a different boss. The weekly wildcard missions have been changed, so there is a new legendary to get. And the Maurice Black Market now has a new location and new legendaries for you guys to get. Here's a big one for PC players, so that lag you get from the shaders compiling, apparently they fixed that. So hopefully after this update, you should not be lagging anymore really bad. But we'll have to wait and see on that. Now for the meat and potatoes, we got a stupid amount of character buffs. So for Harlo, her action skill 0 point, you know, the face lock bubble. Slam damage increased to 30% and the status immune damage increased by 14.7%. Not a bad buff. For Rafa, he does have a few things here, so increase the damage by 10% for Apophis Lance. For the capstones in the blue tree, we have Project Raiju, now scales by 12% per second, up from 10. Basilisk damage increased by 15%, and also its hazard damage increased by 25%. And then Project Gorgon damage increased by 17%. So all of his capstones for Blue Tree got a buff, and that's quite nice. As for some of his blue skills, we have El Catrin getting crit damage increased by 8% from 7%, so a little bit more damage. Bonus shock damage also increased by 8% from 7%, so overall El Catrin got a nice little buff there. Per my last, you know, that skill for a chance to do double action skill damage. Double damage chance increased to 6% from 5% per point. So they made that skill even better. Onto Rafa's Green Tree for arc knives, we did get a little bit of love here. I will say though, melee is still probably not gonna feel the best. It's still a bit clunky, but they did increase the melee attack damage by 12%, and the dash damage increased by 5%. As for the Green Tree skills, we have Handshake Deal increasing melee damage to 9% from 7% per point. To the last, increasing skill damage from 8% per point from 6%. Alperagus increasing splash damage from 9% from 7%. Liquidation getting a huge buff here, damage increased by 50%. And in case you're wondering, Liquidation is marked enemies killed by Rafa leave behind a corrosion hazard. At the bottom of left tree. Collaborative Ignition, so bonus damage increased to 8% from 6% per point. Synergia, duration increased to 14 seconds from 12 seconds. And melee damage increased to 4% from 3%. In Puhei, we have action skill duration increased to 7% from 6%. And that is it for Rafa's Green Tree. So again, the melee is still, you know, clunky. I hope they fix that in the future. But at least the skills are getting a little bit better. Moving on to Vex. So the Green Tree Incarnate, we have a lot of good stuff here. So phase explosion damage increased to 16.6%. And Eldritch Splash damage increased by 9.5%. For her augment, energy vampire damage increased by 25%, so that's quite nice. You can get that pretty early on. And for the capstones in Green Tree, we have Heart Piercer damage increased by 22%, Desecration hazard damage increased by 50%, huge buff there. Desecration Airborne burst damage increased by 48%, and then Geist Wave damage increased by 41%. So overall, the Green Tree got quite a bit of love, but there's even more, so let's go down here. Radiant Attunement now deals 7% splash damage, up from 6% per point. Dreadlight hazard damage increased by 100%. And Dreadlight is a skill for where if you do gun damage, you have a chance to spawn a radiation hazard. So all of the hazard related skills seem to have gotten a pretty big buff. And then Ars Arcana now increases skill damage by 9% per point from 8. Alright, onto the Red Tree. So Trouble has been, well, Trouble. So they did a lot of buffing here. You can see we have quite a bit. So first off, Trouble's health increased by 10%, and Trouble damage increased by 21.9%. But that's not all. We have the augments buffed up too, so Violent Outburst damage increased by 12.5%, and Immortal Fang damage increased by 34%. For the capstones in Red Tree, we have Trouble Bubble damage increased by 33%, and then for the passives, Bloodless Magic now increases action skill damage by 8% per point, and Claw and Bang now increases melee damage by 8% per point. So overall, the Trouble, you know, pet build, Red Tree got quite a bit of stuff, but it still kind of suffers from the pet AI being a little bit goofy. I'm hoping we see some changes on that in the future too. And then finally for Vex's Blue Tree, we only had a little bit here, but nonetheless, still good stuff. Fel Inscription's melee damage increased to 7% per point. Recurrence now increases melee damage by 0.2% per stack. And then Haruspeck's Phase Dagger damage increased by 11.7%. Not bad. And then finally on to Amon. He got gigabuff. Dude, like, look at all this. We're reading all this, by the way. So first off, we're starting in Blue Tree here, so it's going to be the Scourge action skill, you know, the big shield. Scourge has had its maximum vengeance increased by 50%, that's quite nice, making it able to absorb more damage and deal more damage with the Forge Whip when consumed. And Forge Whip damage increased by 27%, not bad. For the augments in Blue Tree, almost all of them were buffed. So Blast Chill damage increased by 45%, Molten Rebuke damage increased by 86%, yeah. Eternal Winter Massive Forge Wave damage increased by 100%, Stormlance damage increased by 52%, and Stormlance Detonation damage increased by 10%. Amon, my guy, you're looking good. As for the capstones in Blue Tree, Glacial Rupture got some love. I tried messing with this in the past and it didn't feel that great, so I'm glad, you know, they buffed it up. So Glacial Rupture capstone now has a 60-second cooldown from 70. Glacier Rapture Forge Whip damage increased by 16%, Glacier Rapture Fissure damage increased by 41%, and Wrathfall damage increased by 46%. So the capstone should be a lot better now. For the passives in Blue Tree, Scorch Kairos now 6% per point, Battleborn 4% per point, Scar Tissue we're 9% per point instead of 8, Eternal now 5% per point, not 4, Worldbreaker damage increased by 50%, Winter's Kiss increased to 10% per point instead of 8, and Strike the Anvil now 15% per point. Moving on here to Green Tree, we have Crucible and Forge Axe damage increased by 12%, which is quite nice, and Double Edge's Twin Forge Axe damage increased by 10%. For the augments in Green Tree, Axe and Stone now has cooldown restoration by 40% and ordnance restoration by 40% instead of 33. Endless War gun damage taken increased by 20% from 15. However, the Hammer Forge Hammer damage increased by 14%, Blade Tempest Forge Sword damage increased by 13%, and Blade Tempest Forge Sword detonation damage increased by 4%. Moving on to the capstones in Green Tree, so Snowball damage increased by 38%, Storm Surge Impact damage increased by 10%, Storm Surge Forge Storm damage increased by 60%, and Conflangarang, I always said it wrong, Conflangarang capstone Fire Trail damage increased by 100%. Not bad. And now for all those skills in Green Tree, there is quite a few. So Gathering Storm here increased to 3% per point. Executioner crit damage, 4% per point. Destruction Engine, 6% per point for the Forge skill damage. Destruction Engine also giving detonation damage by 8% per point. Tempered Pyre Forge Axe damage increased by 19%. Tempered Ice Forge Hammer damage increased by 18%. Masterwork now increases Forge Drone's damage and duration by 10% and 8% per point. Tempered Lightning Forge Sword damage increased by 13%. Lightning Rod Elemental Bolt now deals 40% of damage dealt, up from 30%. If you guys don't know, this skill is ridiculous. So it is a 1 in 4 chance to spawn a hard-hitting Lightning Bolt, and they made it even stronger, so huge, huge. Escalation now increases Forged Drone attack speed and movement speed by 5% per point. Hone Point increases Forged Drone's critical hit chance by 5% per point. And then finally, Heat Exchange now increases Cryo and Incendiary damage by 8% per point. Green Tree is stacked. My goodness. And then finally, on the Red Tree, we have quite a few things here. So Onslaughter, that's going to be your little fiery punch thing. Onslaughter shield restoration increased by 15% per second instead of 10. Onslaughter rocket punch damage increased by 78%. So before this action skill was hitting like a wet noodle, unless you dip into Groundbreaker, it didn't feel too good. So I'm glad they increased the damage on that. Molten Slam now has a 60-second cooldown, down from 80, so that's huge for the Hammer Slams. And then Molten Slam damage increased by 50%, so quite nice to have that. For the augments in Red Tree, they got really buffed up. Do I even need to say this anymore? This patch is ridiculous. Felfrost damage, 71% more. Fulminating Fist damage, 69%. Nice. For the capstones in Red Tree, Horde Cleave now has a 55-second cooldown, so they brought that down a bit from 65. Horde Cleave damage increased by 11%. Horde Cleave detonation damage increased by 18%. Molten Royal now has a 70-second cooldown, down from 80, so I'm glad they're bringing the cooldowns down for a lot of this stuff. Stormcutter, 65 seconds from 75. And then Stormcutter damage increased by 65%. And then for the Red Tree skills, we have a Heavy Plate increasing maximum shield to 7% per point. Wield the Storm increasing status effect damage and duration by 7% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases melee damage by 8% per point, and also increases skill damage by 4% per point. Harbinger now increases melee damage by 2% per stack instead of 1. Mortal Flare damage increased by 22%. And Judgment now increases melee damage by 10% per point instead of 8. So yeah, what do you guys think about the patch notes today? I'm very happy with it, and I'm glad Amon got the most love because he definitely needed it. But that being said, I'm glad that, the other characters got their buffs too. I just hope they fix melee and pet stuff because it still feels kind of poo-poo right now. But I'm sure we're going to have many patches coming in the future. Anyways, let me know below in the comments what you guys think about this patch. And also, if you haven't yet, be sure to hit that sub button because I have a lot more cool content coming in the future. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out.